Welcome to Security and GRC Decoded, the podcast where security, governance, risk, and compliance professionals, CISOs, executive leaders, and practitioners can stay ahead of industry trends and challenges. I'm your host, Raj Krishnamurthy, founder of Compliance Co. Join us twice a month to bring you expert insights, actionable strategies, and real-world stories to elevate your security, governance, risk, and compliance programs. Each week, we decode the complexities of GRC to help you make smarter decisions and drive innovation in your organization. Let's dive into today's conversation. Welcome.
Hey. Welcome to Security and GRC Decoded. I'm Raj Krishnamurthy, your host. And today we have a fantastic guest today, Ayoub Fandi. Ayoub is a staff security engineer, assurance engineer at Gitlab. He's also a co-author of the GRC Engineering Manifesto and is a well-respected figure in the GRC community. Welcome, Ayoub.
Thank you very much for having me. Looking forward to the conversation.
Let's decode. So I want to start off with, maybe we'll start off with a personal sort of touch to it. So can you share your journey into GRC and what inspired you to adopt engineering to approach to governance, risk, and compliance?
So yeah, of course. So I've been in security for about 6 years now. Started in consulting, like Big Four, bigger kind of consultancy companies. And because I don't come from a technical background, when I started in security, I wanted to kind of get my building blocks in terms of understanding how infrastructure works, how development works. And when I started applying some of the concepts I was learning in AWS or doing some courses on software development, I was seeing that applying that in the context of compliance, there was a massive mismatch. And so I started in 2018, cloud started becoming a bigger thing. Everyone was thinking about AWS, etc. And then you go on ISO, and then you see those controls that you need a static list of IP addresses, or you need to integrate security into project management. And it felt very waterfall. It felt very on-prem. And I was getting more and more cognitive dissonance. It's my learning is in one side, and my practice at my job is a completely different mindset. And when I moved to the UK, I worked at a very small startup, and we built the ISO program from scratch. And then I was able there to kind of see in a cloud native context how I kind of mix that with compliance. And because, it's small companies, very engineering / product driven, the BS amount they can take is very low. So if you don't meet them where they are, most likely they won't do it. So I started using JIRA and some of the tools they were using to integrate myself into the pull requests and how they handle projects. And it made me think GRC would benefit a lot from having an approach where you bridge the gap with the engineering stakeholders you work with, because it makes GRC faster and more efficient, but it also makes it more accurate. And I think that's where I was seeing quick wins where they liked me more, so I could get actually the data I need, but also at the same time, I was getting more relevant data, and I was also getting closer to real-time data. Instead of getting something once a year, doing a walkthrough, I could just call an API and get the data every week or every day if I wanted to, which meant I could monitor how things were operating more on a continuous basis instead of once or twice a year. So that's how it kind of started.
Got it. So it looks like you like challenging status quo. So maybe let me ask you this. What is one controversial opinion you have in GRC?
I would say one controversial opinion I do hold dearly is I think external certifications are extremely overrated. So I would say they do have a bit of value, but I would say they should just be a positive externality of a well-oiled GRC program instead of the objective of any particular team. And I think if you work in GRC and you've been through a couple of audits, you know how much art there is instead of science into it. And, we can talk about scope manipulation, the way you design your controls for SOC 2. There's so many ways through which you can make it less and less assurance driven. So then when your customers are looking at it, they don't really see what's behind it. But you that went through the audit, you actually know that the value it holds is fairly low. And I think another type of stakeholders that know is like the control owners. So sometimes you prepare for an audit, so you ask questions to maybe the head of InfoSec or maybe like someone that works in engineering. And the type of question you ask, they're not related to what they do in the day-to-day or where the actual risky areas are for them. So they answer your questions, but also think, this is not accurate. This does not hold value. So I think for me, I think it's fairly overrated. Some people might disagree, which is perfectly fine with me as well. Share all like the comments you have on like where you think they're like maybe underrated or like fairly rated.
Got it. You have some very strong opinions, Ayoub. So what is your view of GRC? And how do you think it differs from the traditional interpretations, and why?
So for me, if I want to split, like I think GRC is, when you say GRC, I think we often mean compliance. I would say like if I had to do a split, I would say 60% compliance, maybe 30% risk, and governance is just like, 10%. It could be zero. It's just like having policies, having maybe an awareness program, and maybe a phishing campaign once a year. So it's like, for me, it's very compliance driven. And I think the main issue, we often hear about security versus compliance debates. It's a very hot, like, debated topic in our industry. And I would say, like, the way I view GRC is, for me, the guardrail that ensures your security program is like, you have an accurate view of how your program is running. And I think it's fairly far from how it is right now. And I think the main issue there is because it's so compliance driven, when the security org as a whole, they're trying to, let's say, win a fight, something where it's very challenging for them to get like executive buy-in. I was thinking of like MFA, for instance, right? Or like local admin rights. So they need everyone they can to help kind of push the envelope for the security team, because it's such like it increases the risk posture by so much. But often GRC, they're not in these conversations, because what they think is like, is this directly related to like a requirement we have from a compliance perspective? Okay, no. You do whatever you want. Yeah, we don't actually care about the outcome, because the outcome is not relevant for our job. And I think we need to make security outcomes relevant for GRC.
Beautifully said.
And for me, that's what's going to change the approach, making compliance just an externality instead of the whole purpose of the team.
Got it. No, I actually came across your GRC engineering manifesto a couple of months ago. Loved it. Now, for our audience, can you what inspired you to co-author this GRC engineering manifesto? Can you describe that a little bit? And most importantly, what hope do you expect to have on the industry and the community?
So in terms of like the genesis, I think, so kind of a pool of practitioners who are all like kind of doing GRC engineering stuff in our own companies of different size, different challenges, but we all were like, relatively fairly big technology companies. And what we saw is like, we didn't, like, no one codified the approach that we thought was relevant for GRC as of that time. So when we're speaking about GRC engineering, some people might think we think about integrating the engineering teams with GRC, and some other people might think it's like making GRC processes like more engineering driven. So there's like different ways of thinking about it. So what we wanted to do is like have it's just it's to try. We tried to like codify some of what we thought was like relevant and like almost universal in the context of like GRC engineering. So like being more product driven, seeing GRC as a product, being more focused on systems thinking. So some of these things that for us are like kind of lackluster in how we practice currently. And we wanted to like make it almost as like key milestones when you're thinking about GRC engineering. Like you need to have these in mind when you think about this. So for us, that was the first thing. I think another thing is almost like marketing tool. I think GRC is often seen as like the less interesting area to work on in security, maybe like less shiny than like maybe, pen testing or even like CloudSec, working at AppSec, etc. So we also wanted to highlight how interesting GRC could be if you thought about the problems in a different way. And for us, like, it also helps kind of close the skill gap a bit, just because if we have more like technically minded people or even like software engineers that are interested in like working in our field, we can make like a massive impact in the industry as a whole, because a lot of people that work in GRC, because of their background, most likely they can't like interact with APIs and like build some of the stuff we need to build that practice. And I think kind of either getting people to be more technically minded or having technical people join our industry, like both of these outcomes for us is a massive win, just because I think our industry like has most of its main core principles that date back to the Enron days. Like I had at least 20 years old. So we wanted to like kind of have all of these concepts that, you know, shook the world in terms of like the DevOps revolution and etc. Have it in the context of GRC.
Got it. Go ahead.
So in terms of also like the value for us, I think it's we really wanted to have like GRC engineering as a way to have a program that is not driven by compliance, as I said, but more driven by risk. Like for us, a proper GRC program, as compliance is just one of the outcomes that you get a couple times a year, the way you run your program on the day-to-day is by being risk-based. Because by following the risk approach, you know the trade-offs of every decision, and you have to prioritize using all the data you have internally to know which problems you're trying to remediate, because you can't do everything. And you actually focus on problems that do exist instead of just focusing what's in the list of requirements from your compliance standard, which might not even be problems at your company. Maybe you already cleared everything. So I think for me, like it's having a more like risk driven program is super relevant, because compliance is almost like professional inventory team. We're very good at recording a lot of stuff, right? Like we get so many observations from or like issues that come up of our audits. Maybe we don't even have any, right? We're so good, like no qualification or SOC 2 perfect. It doesn't mean there's no problem in the company. And being so driven by, you know, we collect everything, we get all that data, and then, you know, that data, we don't really know what to do with it. It makes us once again like completely, because if you pass a cert from a compliance perspective, you did your job. But like if you work in incident response, like how can you say you did your job? There's always new incident that happen. Like the attack surface might like increase every single day. So there's no specific outcome they're driven by. They're driven by risk, right? They focus on the areas where like attacks are most likely, and they reduce the potential impact or the potential probability on these specific like attack vectors. Whereas us, we don't have that. So we want, like just engineering, the approach, we want to move towards that. Because that also when we speak the same language as the other security teams. Because they all work towards like vague outcomes, right? Being more secure. But we have very defined outcomes, which is like certifications, attestations. But I think it's like almost like a false flag. We think we achieve something, but we just like hamster in the wheel. We're just going again and again and again. So that's for me, like, we want to go from being like data gatherers and like just like filling out databases to being people that actually help push the envelope on the remediation side.
Beautifully said. Okay, got it. Now, I think you're pointing to something very interesting, right? Because I think the word data gatherers is a fantastic word. So beyond data gatherers, I think you're also pointing to the mismatch in cadence, right? With what, for example, the DevSecOps team operate and what the GRC team operates. So what is your view on how do we integrate GRC with DevSecOps?
Yeah, that's a great question, because I think DevOps and DevSecOps, I think it impacted GRC a lot more. I think it had a big impact because like the way we produce software changed dramatically. And especially like the number of things handled by developers like increased as well. Like we have like the split between production and development changed a bit. And I think like when you think about DevOps and DevSecOps, you think about, you know, a CI/CD pipeline. That's one of the main things we think about. And that's where most of the like code is produced, and then it'll be tested and then like deployed from there. And in terms of like us in GRC, we still think about like a software development project. I like those gates that you need to go through. And then at each gate, you might have a check. And then if you pass that check, you go to the next gate. And we're a bit like uneasy with like this whole process being almost completely automated with no human involved and no one to like, put that stamp of approval before it goes to like deployment. And I think it forces us to change because we won't revert back to something before DevSecOps to satisfy GRC. It's not going to happen. So we have to go with whatever is going on right now, which is making software quicker, more efficient, like you're faster to like make sure you're ahead of your competitors in your industry. And in this context, like GRC, when you think about the CI/CD pipeline, you need to understand where you need to know what's happening. And like tools like policy as code are super helpful because like, let's say you go on CI mode and then you have the build of like the after the push, there's the build. And then when the build happens, you want to check for specific things, right? You want to check maybe there's no secrets. You want to check maybe that, you use like, if it's like maybe infrastructure as code, you want to check that, encryption is like by default enabled for like all the buckets that are going to be like spun up. So for all these things, it's easier than ever because everything is declarative. So there's like literally a recipe book, like a Terraform plan that you can check and you know which lines you care about. And this is so powerful because before it was happening almost in a black box. And then you had the output and then you had to be involved either super early in the design phase or way late when it's already shipped. But now the way things are built is like by saying like, build me this Kubernetes cluster, which means you can be involved in a more meaningful way because you can change the recipe book. But for that, you need to understand the recipe, right? So that's the thing where there's like also this mismatch of skills. Like you need to understand what Terraform is. And like now we don't go on like the console to like create a new VM. Like you state what you want. And then anytime the desired state like is not with the real state, it changes. So we destroy infrastructure and we build a new one. And I think this mindset shift that needs to happen is super helpful for us because when everything is written down, you have traceability, you have audit. Everything is in potentially version control, which means you can know what changed, how it changed. For GRC, it's a mine of information. Everything is in there. The only thing you need is to get the right like amount of skill to understand how these things work. And like policy as code might be complex, but maybe you can start even just like learning how your team uses Terraform and kind of understanding like, okay, like just tell me which lines as a security person I should know about. And they say, this is the one about access control. This is the one about encryption. And just getting this first steps, you're already way ahead of most GRC teams, and you can have an impact on actually making like your software development pipeline a lot more secure. And also you still satisfy all the controls you need to for compliance. So it's like complete win-win.
No, absolutely. In fact, it is very interesting. One of our previous guests, Carlos Batista, made this statement. He said, we are moving from the idea of ClickOps to GitOps, right? Mm-hmm. And that's a sort of, I think that's a beautiful thing that you said. So what do you see as the biggest challenges in building a GRC engineering program, and how can organizations overcome that?
So I would say, for me, I see a couple. I would say a big one for me is the background of most of the GRC management / directors / heads of. I think the way, so if you think about engineering management, most of the time an engineering manager has been an engineer in the past, and then they moved to management. So they share the same context, same terminology, they understand the work. If you move towards a more GRC engineering approach, you might come across your manager as someone that is more from the traditional side of GRC. Maybe they came through Big Four in IT audit, SOX, and then they moved to like typical view we see in our industry. The issue with that is there's often a office politics stuff happening where there's a loss of control, at least partial loss of control, because some of the expertise is not in the hands of management. It's in the hands of potentially like an IC that does this work that helps like forward the program. I would say that in this case, like automation and like gaining time in the way you do GRC, it's also something that might be seen as like if we make it more efficient, maybe I don't need as much headcount, which I might lose some power as well in terms of I might be less like properly staffed for my objectives and stuff. And like I think they're like legit stuff like that you can point out, but I don't think they're like relevant if you think about it holistically. If you're like a head of and you want to run your GRC program, most likely you've butted heads with the other heads of or the other leadership because they couldn't give you like the screenshot you wanted, or they were not fast enough to prepare for the audit because they have other deadlines from other stuff, and I don't really get why they have to jump on all these things where they could just like, just call this API, get that data, and then be done with it. So by having an engineering approach, what you do is like you acknowledge that your GRC work is creating toil for everyone else. Because I think it's something we forget. Like not everyone in the company like is here to like satisfy like compliance requirements. They have jobs, right? They do lots of things, right? And their role is not just to be available for you when you need them for like a walkthrough or something. And just engineering understands that getting the single source of truth where it is and pulling that information in a more like autonomous way is actually making also work easier for them, because less context switch, like less opportunity for you to mess things up because, hey, you take a screenshot, maybe you didn't take the right one, or maybe they toggled something off. So it creates a context where everyone is feeling like they're like respected in terms of like my time is valuable, like, I have other priorities, which means then when you need them for an actual remediation, then they'll be available. Because if 90% of the time you spend with control owners is for walkthroughs and requesting like screenshots instead of remediating some stuff that were found, then you're not really advancing the program. You're just keeping the same thing running, but it's not moving the needle. And if you win that time that is not valuable to them, when you actually need help on like, some cloud security stuff, and sometimes you need the might of compliance or the might of risk to help the InfoSec team. And then in this case, because they know you've like kind of made everything you could to not like bother them as much and like be as autonomous as you can, they see the good intent and they see that you done the best. Maybe in some cases, it's more likely that you get the wins you need. Because, you work with humans, you don't work with machines. So there's also this aspect that you need to think about. So I think that's one of the challenges I see. And I think potentially, if you think about it, you frame it the right way, I don't think that's as much of an issue.
Got it. I think you talked about you're working with humans. And how do you think the GRC engineering enables that relationship building among stakeholders?
So I would say a good like positive externality of GRC engineering is you win time, right? You spend less time on like, stuff that is not valuable, especially like evidence collection, some of the stuff that can take a lot of time. What do you use this extra time for, right? What's the ad? Like maybe you win a day a week or something. I think what you need to do is to build those bridges with the other teams, because the issue we have in GRC is we're very wary of the scope we have because most of our work is manual. So we can only test so much when all the testing is happening in like Google Sheets and Google Docs. When we actually can test more because we use, a machine-driven approach to testing, then in this case, we can actually have a scope that mirrors a bit more the actual production scope and not the compliance scope that is like, kind of artificially kept small. So in this case, like you want to build like stronger relationship with the application security team, because maybe like it's very tough for them to go past SAST. Maybe they have SAST scanning, but they want to go deeper. They want to go like do a bit more like secret detection, maybe like more dynamic testing, but they can't get to the heads of engineering and stuff because they say, no, it's all about speed. It's all about delivery. Like want to make sure we can ship quicker. Like in this case, like having you kind of highlighting some of the compliance requirements, but also like kind of building those relationships where you say, hey, like what we can do maybe first step is have some tests that run, but that don't like, we just record the violations. Hey, from a compliance perspective, we want to record stuff first. So we have the violations recorded, but it's not stopping like software from being shipped. And then you can like kind of have those calls. Maybe you educate them on like, look at everything we found. We didn't stop like the deployment, but look at everything that was found just beforehand, and kind of going through that with them. And everyone is sensible, like sees everything, and they want to understand like, is it actually like dangerous? I see some criticals in there, and that's where we can then go to the risk-based approach and say, hey, in collaboration with the application security team, we're working on like these 5 super important milestones we want to hit for this year, and one of them is like related to a lot of vulnerabilities you've had. And hey, like this fix, like you can work with the team and you can actually like help AppSec go towards their own goals by being that kind of conduit. And you're seen as neutral because you're not directly in a relationship with them, but at the same time, you're seen as trustworthy because you have that background of like, hey, there's also like risk, there's compliance, like we report these things to the board. Like there's like this way through which you can build those bridges that benefit like security, but also benefit the other security teams. So they can also have another ally that is like has the same goal, but also comes from like a different perspective. So it's often because sometimes when security is the department of no, every team like infra might hit infosec, engineering might hit application security. So that on every side they might not like the direct counterparts, but you coming as like almost like neutral third party, and then you can also kind of help in some of these programs that need like to be pushed forward to increase security.
Got it. Do you get any pushback from these teams, and how do you handle that?
So I would say you might get pushback, but I would say the way you should do it is you should deliver wins before you ask for stuff. So like before you come across and say, we need to focus on this thing, like this is super critical, it should almost be like months or year where you don't do anything other than like record what's happening and almost like evangelize. You need to educate. And I think what you can do is like, if you work in conjunction with your AppSec team, instead of just doing like security awareness, like work on secure code training, work on like some bug bounty programs internally, work on some hackathons. There's lots of ways through which you can build that trust with no strings attached. And then when you actually need something from them, from a security perspective, like the trust is built. It's like if you just come for like specific requests, like it's seen as like not genuine, and it's very easy to tell. Whereas if you actually care about like the developer experience and you actually make efforts when you choose security tooling, find one that's not disruptive, that really integrates well with how they work, maybe like, that fits well with the IDEs or like the way the CI/CD tool you use. Like, I think not underestimating how important like their experience as like working as a developer or as like a cloud engineer, if you disrupt it like a lot with your security, they either like hate you or circumvent it, and you lose in both ways. So it's sometimes you might actually have to like lose a bit of like security in the short term to ensure you get buy-in because you didn't disrupt their workflow too much. So I think you can't just enforce everything. I think sometimes you have to say no, you have to be direct, but sometimes it's not the best way to get to that desired outcome.
Got it. Now, I want to double click on the quick wins. What do you think can be the potential quick wins for organization adopting the GRC engineering practice?
So I would say like one very like crystal clear one is like reporting. I would say like in GRC, we're very bad at getting good dashboard and reporting in place. Because the data is all over the place. It's not structured. So it could be in like documents, could be in PDFs, could be in XLS files. So because it's not like machine readable in one easy format to parse and then maybe share with like a BI tool or whatever, we have often like very manual ways of reporting to executive and leadership as well. So I think with GRC engineering, we're thinking like everything should be in a machine readable format. It's almost like we replace XLS with JSON or, with a SQL database. So in this case, when you have everything in a way that is easy to parse, it's also super easy from that to build dashboards. And when you need to get to your information, everything flows neatly because everything is like has a purpose and everything has been designed with like proper data schema, etc. Whereas when you have to like do a VLOOKUP here and then like put it back into a PDF that you share in like a Google Slides, like it gets all over the place. And there's like so many different ways for you to like introduce human error or like, inaccuracies. So that's one way. I would say that like the other way is through having that single source of truth. I think when you work in GRC engineering, the goal is to get almost like a data lake where all of data lives in one place. So you pull from all the systems, and that data, instead of living in 3-4 different places, it only lives in one place. So it makes reporting easier, but also it ensures that risk and compliance has the same data. Because we see silos often in GRC, and even if GRC is only a subset of security, often risk and compliance, they don't communicate as much. And that creates like top 5 risks or top 10 risks is the register is in one way, and then the risks that were identified in the audits is a completely different list. And none of that is communicated because they speak to different people and they care about different things. And I think when you start using the same data and you think about data in the same way, you might actually pull information that was like gathered by compliance for your program because it's in the same place. So then it's easier for you to speak the same language, to use the same terminology, to think about risk, to think about like issues, which potentially like fosters more collaboration and ensures like holistically you can have like a more accurate vision of your program.
Got it. Better reporting, single source of truth, maybe 2 quick wins that organizations.
Absolutely.
Okay. But we are in 2025, and I don't think we can have a podcast without talking about generative AI and large language models.
Absolutely.
So what do you see as the role in advancing GRC engineering? And what do you particularly see are their limitations?
So I would say like generative AI, and especially like 2025 is the year of AI agents. Okay, it's the buzzword for 2025. So I would say the value add of AI is it completely kind of follows the mantra of GRC engineering because the goal is anything that is relatively deterministic, simple, but cumbersome for you humans to do. You can have an AI agent to do part of these tasks to liberate some time to focus on like high leverage activities. So typically, I think like 2 big areas for me is like typical like gap assessments or way through which like you would test maybe your controls against NIST-CSF to get like a score or whatever, like a maturity level. If you can just dump all of your information, almost as if you're doing like a self-audit, you pull all the information, and then like an AI agent would go through everything and test it for you and check wherever your gaps are, etc. I think it's useful because you need to do that, but it's mostly a documentation exercise. It's a way to understand if you have everything neat, but it won't tell you as much. But it still can take like probably weeks if you do it with an external firm. And it's, of course, you pay for it as well. And it might be like relatively expensive. So insourcing that potentially or using a company that does that through AI agents, I think is one win. And another one for me is anything related to third-party risk. I think there's a massive issue there for me. Like, of course, everyone loves to trash questionnaires. Okay, look, it's a well-known like trope at this point. But even if we don't speak about questionnaires, just like how do you assess your vendors? How do you ensure your vendors like you can actually trust them in your supply chain? And I think the way AI could be used is, often you send a questionnaire or whatever, an assessment, and then you record the results, and then you kind of hold them in a place, and then maybe you just say, yeah, the vendor is fine, we use that vendor. The issue with that is you don't really know like your attack surface around supply chain. You have no vision because you send potentially like a very standard questionnaire, and most likely you don't actually check the results because there's 600 questions. Maybe you check only where they said no. And they could lie as well, which is an issue. And I think when we come at a time of trust centers where companies love to now kind of showcase bits of their security programs in a specific website that can be queried, like having a way for an AI to parse through like all of your vendors, trust centers, and bring you that kind of third-party risk posture that is a living thing. So you could have like regularly checks of like, hey, this vendor just changed. Like now they don't use Okta, they use a different way of doing SSO. Or, oh, this vendor, it's been almost 2 weeks since like their SOC 2 expired and there's not the new one that hasn't been uploaded yet. And you could focus on the controls you care about, and you can ask that AI agent to check for like SSO, to check for changes to like the way they do encryption or like, anything like this. And you could get like regular feedback. And wherever it's not matching anymore, you can just reach out to, the point of contact you had at a vendor. And in this case, like you actually can have almost a dashboard of all your vendors and potential weakness areas, and you could manage hundreds of vendors that way. So I don't know if that exists, but that's a way through which I see AI like making it a lot easier for you to like manage your vendors, which is like most likely your biggest attack surface.
Got it. And I think you're almost making a case for GRC being an orchestrator of agents. I don't know whether to call them GRC agents or security agents, but some sort of agents, right? And to go execute and collect the data and standardize and normalize them and all that stuff.
Yeah. I think we can have that role just because we pull from all the other teams. We almost have except maybe for the CISO, we're the only team that has all of the pieces of the puzzle because we need to. The other teams, they're very focused on the vertical. So someone that works in cloud maybe doesn't really know what's happening in incident response or some of the other teams. So because we get that complete picture, maybe we're the best team to be the orchestrators.
Oh, that's beautiful. So you also run a GRC engineering podcast, Ayoub, and I love it. I've listened to it. What can you share with our listeners some key insights about building a strong GRC engineering practice that you gained through those podcast discussions?
Absolutely. So we had quite a bit of guests, different backgrounds, different stage as well in their programs. I would say if I had to pick a couple, I think the first one is to really get a list of what you want to achieve from GRC engineering. I think because now we have the compliance automation space, so people see some fairly obvious ways through which you can like make your program more effective. So of course it's like related to evidence collection, most likely. But I would say in your specific context, maybe it's not the thing you should be focusing on. So for example, I think it was with Akshay, used to head GRC engineering at Zoom. We spoke about access control. So typically like some companies, they might need to have those GRC engineering resources focusing on how you do access reviews on a quarterly basis. Right? So maybe making that more effective because maybe there's hundreds of controls, hundreds of systems that are outside of your SSO platform. You need to track in a different way, but maybe you need to federate everything so you can manage it in one way. And sometimes like being able to pull from everything and having a central console, it might take a couple of months, but it might like make your job way, way easier. And it also like helps actually like improve your security just above and beyond just compliance. So I'd say that's one of the insights, like really having a plan. Another one I would say is like, when you think about build versus buy, it's not clear cut. So I think people like the idea of building because it looks cool, because it's like you're coding stuff from scratch. You're like, like you're going into uncharted territory. I think we had this discussion with a couple of guests. I think if you have a plan, sometimes like build is not the right place. Sometimes you need to buy. Especially if you're smaller, your tech stack is very standard. Like in these cases, why reinvent the wheel? Because what people forget is like you buy a tool, so you pay the price for the tool. But also when you build, like you pay for it because you spend engineering hours. So it has a cost in terms of like human hours. And people often forget that time, like it's a free time. But you pay these people and often you pay them fairly well. So if they can be focused on something else and that tool can take part of the job, I think it's something that people need to think a bit more, because often they're like super quick to jump on like the build bandwagon, but you really need to think about the pros and cons for your company. So I would say like that's two big instances. I think the last one is you need to be friends with your engineers. I think it's one of the first steps is like building that bridge. It's like it's almost like coffee chats, right? It's like, hey, infosec guy, hey, can you just jump on a call 30 minutes? I want to ask you some questions about like encryption in AWS. Or like you talk to someone in AppSec, like I want to do, how do we do SaaS? Like, how does it work? And I think like you need to be friends with these people before like partner with them. And when you're friend with someone and like it's someone that you trust and you've had conversations, when you actually need help and when you need to understand something with like a specific purpose in mind, they'll get you the answer. They, even if they don't have the answer, they know who has the answer. And getting like those champions for GRC inside the security org is very like underrated. And I think building GRC engineering in a vacuum without all of those blocks like being built first, I think it's a recipe for disaster. Because when you need access to a tool and you need high privilege access, like to pull that information, they say, who are you? What do you need? Who? Like, no, like you need to almost pitch us first. But if I know you, I know what you're building, we've been chatting for months, like, of course, I know what you're trying to do here, and I actually completely agree with your approach. And it's a lot easier to get people internally to also help you win and get that access you need to, like, kind of kickstart some of those just engineering initiatives.
Absolutely. I think you almost need to have them on speed dial. So,
exactly.
What would you advise, or what would you aspiring professionals who are trying to specialize in GRC engineering?
So a couple of things. I would say it depends where you come from. So if you're currently a software engineer and you come from that side, I would say that the best way is to learn more about GRC and learn about GRC issues. So of course you can listen to this podcast, you can probably listen to GRC engineering podcast as well. I think you need to learn the terminology, how things work in compliance, because a big problem we have is GRC people, they're not used to work with software engineers. So translating business requirements for GRC into technical requirements for a developer is very challenging because someone that works in dev doesn't really understand like GRC issues. And it's tough for us to like go from, hey, like, you know, audits to assessments to whatever, and get that into like a UML diagram that works from someone that, you know, needs to run like a sprint planning. So I think we need to think more like product, more like engineering from the GRC side. So when you come as a dev, you need to get that additional knowledge of the context of GRC. If you currently work as like a GRC practitioner, I would say that what you need to do is like, the first is probably awareness. So I would say you need to like get your feet wet a little bit in all of these different topics. So we're thinking like infrastructure as code, CI/CD pipelines. It is very easy like to get the first building blocks. Like you can watch some YouTube videos, you can go through a couple of courses. It's like what you need first is like just the terminology, understanding, and what the security considerations I should have when thinking about this topic. Once you have these three, then you can go on the coffee chat route and speak with whoever handles this at your company. Because what you need as quickly as possible is to get company relevant context, because that's what gets you to like thinking about problems that you can solve for your company. And once you have that, and you have that context, and you spoke to the engineers in place, I think that's where you can start thinking with them about what problems you can solve. Because like maybe you saw some best practice in some of the course you did, and you don't do that at your company. And maybe you're like, why? And maybe they will explain you, hey, we architectured the application in a bit of a weird way, so we can't really have that in place. So then you do extra research to understand, like in our context, maybe we have to do more perimeter, and you start thinking in a way through which like you have the engineering mindset in a way that you can use to solve GRC problems. So I think that's first building blocks. I think like scripting knowledge and everything, I think it's helpful, but I think it's easier to find someone to script you something, to find someone to think holistically about the issue. I think scripts, they don't solve GRC problems. What solves GRC problems is to have that like holistic and systems thinking approach, and then you know what to script and what not to script. Because like maybe you need to buy once again instead of building, or maybe you need like give you an example. Like sometimes you want to test a control, maybe related to cloud infrastructure, and you want to go on like AWS Audit Manager or like use AWS Artifact, some of those tools, right? Or Security Hub. But maybe instead, the InfraSec team uses a cloud tool. Maybe they use Wiz or whatever that actually does some of those tests natively.
Right.
and they already compute all the data. You just need to pull the test results out. And in this case, you save a lot of time because you don't have to run these tests and do everything. Maybe what you just need to do is to learn how to pull that data out of the single source of truth right now and to get that for your GRC team. So if you don't think about the problem, who handles the problem from a technical side, how do they work, what systems they use, and just think about like scripting my way out of stuff, you might just end up spinning your wheels and spending like valuable time on like low leverage tasks at the potential problem.
Got it. No, there is a recent post in which you sort of make this point as well, where you're saying that this change is not only technical, it's a mindset, and you have to look at holistically. And you point to GRC architecture and GRC program as a whole. So I want to double click on that, if you will. Can you describe that a little bit? Why do you think this is a mind shift change, and how do you want to approach this?
Yeah, so because GRC engineering, I think, is very appealing, especially for people that aren't in the industry and have had some of the hurdles in terms of like, kind of making stuff more ready for DevSecOps, etc. But I think it's part of a solution that you need to think about as the whole program. So GRC is not only compliance, it's also risk. And, evidence collection doesn't impact risk, right? A lot of these actions, they're not related to risk, but a well-run program is risk-based. So what I think about when I think about GRC architecture is like almost like you need a way to understand like compliance activities, governance activities, risk activities, how do they all interact? And engineering and automation in and of itself doesn't give you that. You need it to automate properly. But automation is not giving you that. You need to think about it ahead of time. And that's why, of course, like now I know in software engineer, architects get a bad rep because we don't like those non-coding architects, etc. But think about more maybe a staff engineer or like a tech lead, okay? More like a nicer term to think about someone that does architecture. When you have a complete view of the systems, you know like the points of failure. You know where you might have like only one-way connections. You know like where like maybe you change this like the magnitude and then the system breaks down and you need to like architecture in a different way. And I think when you think about GRC engineering, you introduce engineering elements into a GRC program, which means you introduce like failure nodes as well, right? Because right now failure nodes are maybe like, hey, I'm copying this like couple of cells from Excel into a different, because everything is manual, the failure nodes is like, I need to redo it again or whatever. Now, when you think about systems as like more engineering, then in this case, there's like the human element sometimes is not there anymore. So they have to be managed differently. And when I think about the architecture is like how all of the GRC activities interact with one another. And you can understand the highest value ones. And from these highest value ones, which ones I actually need to automate first. And which one maybe I don't need to automate maybe because it doesn't take as much time. It's only a couple times a year. Or maybe actually like the human element is critical in this context. So for all these things, you can actually have a hierarchy and know like, okay, this is what I need to focus on. This is what I need to automate first. If we only start with GRC engineering, we might like see, hey, evidence collection takes so much time, boring, I hate it. Let's automate it. But maybe you spend 6 months on something that was not the actual priority. Totally. So that's how I think about it when I think about like architecture versus engineering.
Got it. Take a step back, look at them holistically, allows you to prioritize, to focus, and potentially even build a business case, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay,
Absolutely.
got it. We are at the end of the segment. Ayoub, are there any books, podcasts, people, mentors that have had a lasting impact on you? Can you share anything that for our listeners?
So I would say anyone that is involved in the GRC Engineering Manifesto, I think are people you should probably like kind of link up with. Of course, like Charles. Charles is like legend.
Charles Nato at Netflix.
Absolutely.
Okay.
So he's I think so. Of course, I had him on the podcast, but I think he's someone that really champions that approach to GRC and has been for quite a bit of time.
Absolutely.
So I would say it's valuable resources like people that were involved in GRC engineering. I would say also, of course, I think this podcast will also probably be a great resource because I think you understand GRC engineering fairly well through your work as well, and that I definitely think you kind of think about it in a similar way as we do in the field. So I think for sure it's a great thing to regularly listen to. And I would say the resources you also need is like just getting your technical acumen a bit better. So I would say like just if you like books, read books about, I like some of the O'Reilly books or like Manning publications, some of those like technical book publishers. Like sometimes I read the first couple of chapters from like designing like data intensive applications. So I'll read a book. I'll read just a couple of chapters just to get like some of the context. And I think you need a lot of curiosity to like succeed in the GRC engineering mindset, because if you're in engineering side, like technology moves super fast.
Yeah.
People that work as like software devs and stuff, like they have to keep their skill sharp every 6 months, every year, because like today it's like Python, tomorrow it's Rust, then it's Zig, then it's whatever. Like it changes all the time. And I think like you need to be on that side. Like you need to also understand that you need to keep your skill sharp because your company is moving. So maybe you don't know about it, but they re-architected some stuff and then they use a different tool and then maybe they change like some of the way they do like shipping or whatever. So by keeping like some time during the week to understand like how the industry is moving as a whole, you'll also be more effective like following how your company is doing, because your company is probably also moving at that pace. So like just overall like kind of, some channel. I like Hussein Nasser. He has a channel on backend engineering on YouTube. He does like fairly easy to understand videos around databases and stuff like this. But there's hundreds of channels that does like similar stuff. But I would say like just be more curious on the technical side.
I love it. And this has been a fantastic, fascinating conversation. I'm super happy to have had this with you. Thank you very much.
Yeah, no worries. Glad to partake in this conversation. I really enjoyed it as well.
Thank you for listening to Security and GRC Decoded. We are your go-to resource for staying ahead in governance, risk, and compliance. If today's episode resonated with you, we would love for you to subscribe, leave a review, and share it with your network. To dive deeper into these topics, visit us at compliancecow.com and follow us on LinkedIn for more insights and community conversations. Join us next time as we continue decoding the future of GRC.